Well, good afternoon. Back out for a little bit of a bimble today, and we find ourselves in a bit of a forest. Well, on the outskirts of a forest. Definitely the genre of photography that I find the most difficult. There are so many inspiring photographers out there who can approach a scene of chaos, which is what a forest quite often is, and turn it into something wonderful. I approach the same scene of chaos and end up with a chaotic photograph. But I thought I'd come out this afternoon. It's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Quite subdued light. So this is a bit of a recce, and also perhaps maybe get an image or two. And actually, as I was driving in, I kind of saw this tree here, which I thought was rather nice. Now the light has kind of disappeared again, but I quite liked it. Now it's kind of the colours are half turning. Yeah, maybe. But this is what I mean about chaotic scenes. Just so difficult. But as always, it's good to be out with the camera. So the other thing that I'm limiting myself to here, or the thing that I'm limiting myself to here, is I've actually got the 35mm on, which gives me a 50mm equivalent field of view. On top of that, I'm actually overlaying the 1x1 format on top of the frame, so I actually see a 1x1 square. I was doing some post-processing of some older images, and I really am kind of into that square format. Now quite often I will overlay the square format on the camera just to let me see in that format. On the Fujifilm, if you shoot in RAW plus JPEG, you can do that. The JPEG will be 1x1 and the RAW file will actually be the original format. With the original format, it then, when you bring it into say Lightroom, it has the 1x1 square overlaid that you can move it around. Now the light has kind of disappeared, which kind of is impacting the image somewhat, because what we were getting when the light was slightly out was the little colour of the trees was actually sort of standing out more towards the background. Now what I might end up doing is putting on an ND filter on here, and that will allow me to slow the shutter speed down ever so slightly, because I really like how the greens and the yellows, the turn of the leaves merge together with a slightly longer shutter speed, just with a very light breeze blowing. So I'm focusing again on this little tree. I've actually just moved my composition. This tree, in my first image, I had kind of cut it in half, and I was kind of including the left hand branch leading over to the separate tree. Now I've actually moved the camera just ever so slightly around, and I'm just framing up a slightly different composition. This time including kind of all of that tree, and that's kind of the center sort of focus. Now what I'm not hugely happy with is I'd love the kind of trunk of the tree. It's kind of coming, well, there's two things that now that I sort of reevaluate the image. One, I now don't like the image or the tree behind my main subject. I think it's a little bit too prominent. Secondly, I would like the trunk of my main subject to be maybe slightly more over to the right, but if I kind of move it slightly more over to the right, I then lose the right hand side of the colour, and if I move it too much to the left, it just feels a little bit unbalanced. So they're still struggling with that composition. I love the colour. I think if there was some lovely light on that, this would really pop, but just struggling again with composition. So we have right above us bit of a break in that cloud, and over to my far distance I can certainly see the sun starting to creep towards me. So I'm glad I've kind of held on here. Hopefully what we'll get, no guarantees, but a little bit of light just hitting this tree and not enough to actually penetrate into the forest, and that will let that little burst of colour hopefully stand out against the shadows of the forest. We'll see. Aha, light. Now it's coming and going, and what I've done is I've got a 4-stop ND on. It's giving me about half a second exposure, and I'm actually underexposing as well by about 2/3 of a stop, again just to accentuate the brightest parts of the image, exposing for those highlights. Got a cable release focusing on the tree itself, f11. I could probably even drop that actually, but I'm using the aperture more as a control over the shutter speed. So I'm getting about half a second exposure here. So I'm about 2/3. I'm just going to drop that down a little bit more. By dropping the exposure, using the exposure compensation, what that's allowing me to do is make the tree stand out even more against the darker parts of the image. Focus against the tree, cable release. That sun's just kind of come through a little bit stronger again. Take the shot. It's not bad. It's not awesome, but it's not bad. But hey, we've got the sun. Right, I'm going to take a wander on down now into the forest and see what we can see. So I've barely walked a couple of feet, and I'm back now focusing on this tree which has the burst of colour. Now when I first arrived, in fact, the light is just kind of starting to fade again now, and with the light fading it doesn't kind of have as much kind of character. But again, using that technique of using the exposure compensation to underexpose the image slightly, when the light is on this tree and then the shadows, kind of the forest, the background just sort of drops off, it actually works quite well, I think. So I actually got one taken. Now the reflections here aren't wonderful, even worse there, Nigel, but you can see that just that light really lights up that colour, and then there's just a little bit of light off into the distance, and certainly beyond these main trees, not a huge amount of light. Now I'm glad I kind of took the shot before I started talking to you guys, because that light has once again disappeared. Huge bank of cloud now, so whether that light even comes back, I'll have to wait and see. I also like how it kind of frames the image somewhat. Let's just take another look at that. Ooh. So you can see how it kind of frames the image. It just brings out some lovely textures and tones. And actually my favourite part of that image is actually the little bit of light on the tree trunk in the background, which of course has now completely disappeared. So one of the things when I'm shooting in a forest, I'm always looking for a story. How the trees are kind of interacting with each other. To me, especially when I'm struggling for a composition amongst all the chaos, I look for a story. Look for those trees, look for something that has got character. I'm not saying I found it down here, and in fact the further I walked into the forest, the greener it got, which wasn't really what I was looking for today. But just all around here, with all of the moss, there's just a little bit of character going on here, so maybe, just maybe there's something in here. But that's certainly what I look for. Something that gives me at least a starting point character, a story, and mood. Okay, so I was talking a little about having story, and I was just making my way back up the path again, and I spotted this tree right here. Now, perhaps doesn't look like much on this wider view, but if I bring us in a little bit, you might not be able to see it there either, but with the focal length, 50mm focal length, along with the square format, what we've ended up with is, in my mind anyway, an image where those branches are reaching up and there's just a little pocket of light that they're reaching up to. As I say, it may be quite difficult to see it just because of the reflection. Now what I've done again is, because we're talking here about sort of shadows and light, I certainly don't want to overexpose. I certainly don't want to overexpose those brighter bits. I just want that hint of light. So again, I'm actually shooting at about a stop underexposed. I quite like it. It's just that feeling of kind of the branches reaching up, giving that story. Yeah, I quite like that. So again, always be on the lookout for areas in a forest, rather than looking for a pure composition, looking for that rule of thirds or looking for those lead-in lines. I find it more useful to look for a story, look for character, and then maybe build your composition around that.